I for some reason thought that task runners are kind of dead as development tools, but stats say something else, because looking at the number of downloads of Grunt on npm, I can say that I was wrong. So with around 2.5 million downloads monthly, the task runner is definitely far from being dead, and that's actually the reason why I decided to make this tutorial. Before we start, make sure to watch the videos dedicated to explaining what are npm, task runners and bundlers if you're not familiar with any of them, and without any further ado, let's dive in. So the first thing we need to do is to create a folder, then open a new terminal and type npm init-y, which will create the package.json file for the project. The second step we need to do is to install Grunt by typing npm install grunt-save-dev. Now, even though we have installed Grunt, we still can't use it, so if we run the Grunt command here, as you see, the terminal doesn't recognize it. To solve that problem, we just simply need to install the Grunt command line interface using this command npm install grunt-cli-g. The command is now recognized, however, this time we get a message telling us that we need to create the Gruntfile, which is where we set all of the tasks we want Grunt to do. Having said that, let's create this Gruntfile. That done, we need to type the following code, which is a sort of a wrapper for all the tasks and their configurations. Now within this wrapper we need to call the initConfig method, which takes a configuration object. It is basically where we specify the names of the tasks and how they should be done. So essentially every task is represented by an object. Furthermore, this configuration object can hold any kind of property. It doesn't necessarily have to be a task. In addition to that, Grunt provides a method that reads JSON files from which we can import data to use in the configuration of the tasks. We'll get into that a bit later. So here we are basically using the read.json method to import data from the package file and set its value to the package property as a regular JavaScript object. Back to tasks, they are usually structured this way. A task can have an options object and one or more targets that each can also have its own options object. I know it is a bit vague at the moment, but all will fall into place with the examples I'm going to show you next. Tasks come in a form of plugins, which are like extensions to the core of Grunt. So basically, a plugin is a module to install which makes Grunt understand what exactly it is supposed to do. There are more than 6,000 plugins in total for a wide variety of tasks, and one of the most commonly used is Uglify. This plugin is utilized to do a couple of things, which are the concatenation and compression of JavaScript files. That said, let's first install the plugin by running this command npm install grunt-contrib-uglify-save-dev. Now that we installed the plugin, we need to do some configurations in the initConfig method. First and foremost, we need to specify the name of the task. Then we need to set a target. The key here is arbitrary, so you can choose whatever name you want, but make sure it is as descriptive as possible for when you have more than one target. Then we need to specify a files array, which elements are objects that must have an src property referring to the path of the file we want to compress, and a dest property which represents the path where we want to create the compressed file. For organization purpose, let's create an src folder in a build one which will hold the files generated by Uglify and the other plugins which we'll see later on. Now I'll create a JavaScript file just as an example. And now let's complete the configuration process by specifying the src in the dest paths. The next step we need to do is to load the plugin using the npm load tasks method and pass its name as an argument. And now all we need to do to compress that file is to run this command, grunt uglify. That said, if we take a look at the build folder, as you see, Grunt has created a minified version of the AGS file. We are able to set aliases for the tasks to run them under different commands. To do that, we need to use the register task method. This function takes two arguments, which are the actual task name and the alias, or the name we want to use instead of the real task name. So running grunt compress.js here is the same as running grunt uglify. Now to concatenate JavaScript files, we need to pass an array of paths to the src property instead of a string. In here, the compress.js command concatenates and minifies the AGS and BGS files and outputs the result into the ABMin.js file. We are actually not bound to a single output file, so we can add another object to the files array, and in this object we can set grunt to create another file, which is the result of the concatenation of, say, AGS and a certain CJS, for example. Now, as you may have guessed, running compress.js creates two files, abmin.js and acmin.js. So up until now we have been using only one target, but we can add another one which is pretty much the same as the first target object. Here in the src property we can use the asterisk symbol instead of a specific name. This basically means select all files which names end with .js as input files instead of specifying each file path one by one. Running the compress.js command here again does the same thing as before, except that we added another set of input and output files. Now you might be wondering what is the difference between setting the inputs and outputs in a single target and doing that with multiple targets. Well, the reason behind that is that you don't always want to concatenate and compress some files, so you specify them in a different target. Then, whenever you want to execute that specific action, you have to specify that as a part of the executing command. So, in this example, if we want to run only the compression specified in the second target, we need to run the grunt uglify command, followed by a colon and the target name, which is T2 in this case. Again, we can set an alias for this subtask, if you will, using the register task method. So, the grunt compress abc command here will run the uglify target2 operation only. Uglify accepts an options property in which we can specify a few other things to do other than the main task, which is the minification, or how to do it. One of the options that we can add is banner. The value of this property is some code but written as a string, which will be added to the top of the minified file. Keep in mind that if we add the options object as a direct child of the task, it will be inherited by all the targets of that task. By the way, you can find the list of all the available options at the plugins page on npm or GitHub, and the same thing goes for the rest of the plugins that I'm going to show you in the rest of this tutorial. So in this case, the declaration of the b constant will be present in the output files of T1 and T2. On the other hand, if we add an options object to a specific target, it will have the priority over the options object that is the direct descendant of the uglify task. Notice here that the value of b in the abc file is different from the value of b that belongs to the other output files. Grunt also provides a mechanic similar to template literals in ES6 So instead of using backticks, we need to use a couple of opening and closing percentage symbols and less and greater than signs wrapping an expression to escape it. So if we want to take a value from the package.json file that we imported earlier using the readJSON method, say the name of the project for example, to do that we just need to type the property name in that placeholder we've just created. We can do the same thing with the version property for instance. Again, we can use this method however we want, and an example of that could be the naming of the output files. Same as we did with JavaScript files, we can also minify CSS files using a plugin called CSSMin. So to use it, we need to install it first by typing the following command: npm install grunt-contrib-cssmin --save-dev. Then again, we need to set the task in its configuration in the initconfig function pretty much the exact same way we did with Uglify. Then we need to load the module using the load npm tasks method. And then we need to type the grunt CSSMin command to run the task. The same exact thing can be done to HTML files. So first we need to install the HTMLMin plugin, configure it, load it, and then run it. Notice that the HTMLMin plugin doesn't do much if any at all if we don't specify how the minification should happen in an options object, so let's do that. One of the options we can add is collapse whitespace, which omits every whitespace between tags. In some cases you may want to run more than just one task every time you update some file, and typing say 3 commands to run 3 tasks in each file update is not exactly what you want to do. So to run more than one task with only one command, we need to use the register task method like we did earlier, but this time the second argument must be an array with the task's names as elements. Running the grunt compress command here is equivalent to running grunt uglify, grunt CSSMin, and grunt HTMLMin all together. Furthermore, we can set default as alias, and by doing that we can type only grunt in the command line and it will do the job. We can set grunt to watch for any change that occurs on certain files and automatically run one or more given tasks. To do that we need to use the watch plugin, so let's install it. The configuration of this plugin is pretty simple. We, as usual, need to set the name of the task and within this object we have to set the files property, which holds the paths of the files to watch, and the tasks property, which contains the tasks that Grunt has to run each time we save one of those files. And then again we need to load the plugin. Now once we run the grunt watch command, it will keep listening to any change that occurs on one of those files and run the tasks if that happens. In addition to that, sometimes we want to run a server to see the effect of the update on a certain page we are working on. To do that, we need to install another plugin called Connect. Then, to configure it as shown in the plugin's documentation, we need to set the task name, which is Connect obviously, and within it we need the server object, which in its turn contains an options object. Options has two properties, which are the port number and a base object. Base holds the path to the root directory of the server in an options object in which we need to specify the index page. Then we need to load the plugin. In here we must run the connect task alongside with watch, of course in case you want to run the watch task, and we have to make sure that connect is set the first in the list. Running the grunt command, we got our server working. You see now every time we commit a change, the watch plugin updates the build folder files, and thus we see the change occurring on the page. That being said, notice that I have to refresh the page every time to see the committed updates. The good thing, we can also automate that. To do that, we need to add the live reload property to the watch plugin. And then we must copy and paste this line of code at the very bottom of the body tag in the HTML code. Again, this is essential for the live reload feature to work. Now let's try to change the background color and see if the page gets reloaded automatically after the CSS update. And there we go. Up until now we have been using plugins, which are basically ready to use tasks. However, we can actually create our own tasks so easily. To do that, we need to use the register task method that we have been using to create aliases, but this time its usage is a bit different. So the first argument is the task name, the second one is a descriptive string of the task, and the third is a function which contains the task's code. And by the way, we can install and require modules to be used in the body of the function. In this example, we'll just print a string in the command line once we run the task using the log writeLn method. Furthermore, we can set parameters to the function, which can be used to decide what logic to run inside that function, for instance. To call the task with the arguments, we need to add a colon in the argument right after the task name. We are not limited to one single parameter, so we can add as many as we want. We are also able to call other tasks from within this function using the task.run method. Running my task here runs the code in the callback function, including the HTMLMin task. That was a very basic task, and as you see, we didn't need to set anything in the configuration object. However, if the task is sort of complex and require multi-targets, like some of the plugins we've used, we need to create a multitask instead. To create a multitask, we need to use the register multitask method instead. And again, the first argument is the name of the task, the second is a description of the task, and the third is the function which will hold all the task's logic. Then we need to create a property in the configuration object having the name of the task as key. This object must have at least one target, and the value could be anything, an object, a string, a number, etc. Now, running the Grunt multitask command, the task with both of its targets is executed. And finally, to find the name and the value of the target that has been executed, we need to use this.target to get the key of the target and this.data to get the value. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.